But it was also Curtis Mayfield saying, keep on pushing and we're a winner.
Right.
And, you know, all these things that he said, but he was kind of forgotten. But there was that side of him, the social side. But then...
I don't know if the argument is that Curtis doesn't get the credit that he deserves fully. I think that it's just not talked about as much, and he's not always given the credit.
Few would have imagined that the man once praised as the conscience of American soul music harbored grudges simmering for decades. Just weeks before Curtis Mayfield drew his final breath, he confided to a close associate a list of 9 renowned R&B figures he despised most. Even more astonishing was the fact that each of these names belonged to voices who had sold millions of records and been honored on prestigious stages. Yet behind the glamorous lights, Curtis insisted they had committed deeds so vile they could never be forgiven, feigning illness to skip shows, paying hush money to witnesses, secretly recording phone calls, manipulating radio airplay, stealing their friends' lovers, even turning recording studios into dens of debauchery. And this is the first time the full portraits of those 9 people Curtis Mayfield loathed until his final breath are revealed. Listen closely to every story in today's video, and you will understand why he would rather die penniless than ever lower his head to shake their hands again. And when that curtain of secrecy lifted, the first name emerged as raw proof of the most horrific hypocrisy Curtis had ever witnessed. 1. Al Green, the rotten suit and the contemptible holy masquerade. Perhaps few realized that the tender voice behind Let's Stay Together belonged to a man so two-faced that even Curtis Mayfield could never find it in his heart to forgive. Al Green was the perfect model of a wrecked soul draped in angels' robes. By day, he preached gospel. By night, he indulged in pleasures and perversions people only dared to whisper about. If you want to understand why Curtis Mayfield despised Al Green so bitterly, you only needed to step backstage at one of his shows to see everything. The moment the stage lights went down, Al immediately peeled off his kindly smile and transformed into an irritable, impulsive man ready to berate anyone who dared cross him. In the fall of 1973, at a show packed with fans in Memphis, Curtis witnessed with his own eyes Al Green's bizarre habit that he never forgot. For 3 nights straight, Al wore the same shabby white suit, speckled with yellowish stains around the collar and underarms, reeking of a sour. Acrid stench so strong anyone nearby had to hold their breath. Curtis even heard a few musicians mumble that they could never understand why he would rather let that filthy suit pollute the entire stage than simply have it cleaned. Yet the moment he stepped off stage, Al would calmly preach, lifting his hands in prayer like some messenger of God. What the public never knew was that behind the curtains, he was already pulling a young fan into the dressing room, whispering damp promises Curtis had heard him repeat to dozens of other women. That very sight, the smell of sweat and cheap cologne, soaked into unwashed fabric, blending with his sanctimonious smile, made Curtis vow he could never respect Al Green again. At the start of 1974, Al's scandal exploded when Mary Woodson, a scorned lover, hurled a pot of boiling grits onto him at dawn inside his Shelby County home. Curtis was recording a new album in Chicago at the time, but the news spread rapidly through the soul community. Many quietly murmured that Al's endless womanizing had driven him to the brink of both physical agony and mental collapse. From then on, he abruptly turned to preaching, wearing that same white suit as if it could somehow cleanse a reputation forever stained. Curtis once recalled that in August 1975, backstage in New York, he saw Al sitting alone, rubbing ointment on his burn scars, muttering prayers under his breath. Yet just an hour later, he was coaxing a backup singer to pray privately in a hotel room. Curtis shook his head, remembering it. To him, that white suit was nothing but a tattered curtain of deceit. The longer it stayed on his shoulders, the more it reeked of lies. In daily life, Al Green was known for such a temper, no one dared mention the idea of cleaning his clothes. An assistant recounted that in 1976, after secretly sending the suit to the dry cleaners, he almost lost his job. Al burst into the dressing room, waving the dry cleaning receipt and shouting in his face, "You have stripped away the blessings God gave me from that day on." No one dared touch the lucky suit he believed had redeemed his soul after the grit scandal. But life never stops at nights of feigned repentance. In the years that followed, Al Green kept pursuing a career built equally on moral sermons and soul records, raking in money thanks to his image as the redeemed missionary. He released numerous successful gospel albums and was invited on television to recount his spiritual rebirth like a miracle. Yet behind the scenes, rumors persisted that Al never truly abandoned his old ways. Musicians said even after he became a pastor, he would erupt without warning, berating staff simply because the cologne didn't have the exact sandalwood scent he preferred. Some claimed Al continued handing out cash tips to have special guests escorted through the back door, only to emerge the next morning in a white robe, delivering sermons as though nothing had happened. In recent years, Al Green has retreated to Memphis, living more quietly but still occasionally performing and appearing on TV, to reminisce about his past glory. To the public, he remains a soul gospel legend whose voice could praise God while lulling listeners into sweet delirium. For Curtis, that night in Atlanta in 1977 never faded. It was then he realized that some souls grow so exhausted they must drape themselves in sanctity just to hide stains they no longer have the courage to face. And from that day, Curtis swore he would never mention Al Green's name without an accompanying shake of disgust. But Al Green was not the most wretched hypocrite Curtis ever encountered. Standing right behind him was another R&B angel, a man who turned sexual addiction and chronic debt into a shadowy power that made the entire music industry both crave and despise him. 2. Marvin Gaye, the addiction to lust and contemptible debts. Curtis Mayfield once said, well, yet, if he had to name the one person he most despised, it would surely be Marvin Gaye. Before millions of fans, Marvin always played the part of the tormented lover, crying out his loneliness and drowning in rapturous melodies. Yet behind the stage lights, Curtis insisted Marvin nursed an addiction more insidious than any drug, an unrestrained hunger for sex and a string of vile habits. On June 12, 1976, Curtis was invited by Motown to Detroit to preview Marvin's new demo. When he walked in, he was stunned to find Marvin sprawled on a sofa, his arms wrapped around two young women who couldn't have been more than 20, while his manager silently counted thick wads of cash. Curtis said it was that very night Marvin admitted he had spent tens of thousands of dollars to fuel his habit of bringing strange women into hotels. In just 1 year, Marvin had rented over 40 separate rooms in Los Angeles and Chicago, where he lived in a nonstop carousel of fleshly indulgence. That same year, Marvin began recording Hear My Dear, which was supposedly his bitter confession about a broken marriage. But behind the studio doors, Curtis watched Marvin sign publishing contracts with 3 collaborating songwriters, only to vanish for months without paying them a cent. When confronted, Marvin merely sneered and said, "I'm too tired to remember money matters." By October 1976, Rolling Stone had run a story about a copyright lawsuit worth over $80,000, exposing Marvin Gaye as a lavish spender who chronically dodged his debts. What sickened Curtis most happened the night of February 4, 1977. Marvin arrived at the Sunset Boulevard studio, drunk, reeking of whiskey. He deliberately pretended to forget the meeting to settle royalties for the ballad he and Curtis had co-written, then staggered over, slamming his hand on the recording table, weeping that he had lost his memory from too much sorrow. Curtis later said, "At that moment, I knew Marvin wasn't a victim. He was just a man who used tears to con people." But that wasn't all. Marvin also had a perverse habit secretly recording his colleagues' phone calls and leaking them to tabloids. From the summer of 1975, Curtis heard whispers that Marvin kept at least 50 cassettes capturing private conversations, even heated arguments about unpaid debts. Later, a sound engineer named Paul Watkins confirmed he'd seen Marvin slyly flick on a recorder and tuck the tapes into his coat pocket. Yet this sick curiosity was only one thread in the web of paranoia. Marvin spun around himself. After nights of secret taping and whispers to gossip writers, he still never found peace. People said that as time went on, Marvin trusted no one, forever terrified others would betray him just as he had betrayed them. In the early 1980s, Marvin's career unraveled under the weight of scandals, addiction, and unpaid taxes. He kept moving from city to city, fleeing creditors and the memories of those tapes that had driven so many away. In the final interviews of his life, Marvin tried to paint himself as a man tormented by art, but few still believed in that sorrowful image. And then the tragedy reached its peak on April 1st, 1984, after an explosive argument. His own father pulled the trigger inside their family home in Los Angeles, ending Marvin Gaye's life at 44. The entire music world reeled. The press called him a tragic genius, but many old colleagues, including Curtis, felt only sadness and regret, because in the end, it was the schemes, the fear, and the secrets Marvin had locked away in his dresser that helped push him toward a chasm no one could save him from. 3. Teddy Pendergrass, the golden voice and the irresponsible life that made Curtis Mayfield despise him. Not everyone knew that behind the charming exterior and seductive voice, Teddy Pendergrass was a man willing to bury professional honor just to indulge his whims. To Curtis Mayfield, Teddy was not only detestable, but also a symbol of brazen arrogance. Teddy had such a bad habit that musicians and managers held their breath in dread. Before every performance, he often pretended to be sick or suddenly lost his voice right before showtime. Countless times, promoters had to listen to the same chorus. "I have acute laryngitis. I can't sing," while people saw Teddy calmly partying. Whenever a show was canceled, organizers lost thousands of dollars. Furious audiences pounded tables demanding refunds, and Teddy disappeared as if he had never accepted a single cent. In the fall of 1979, that very irresponsibility erupted into a major scandal in Chicago, the city where Curtis Mayfield was born and which he considered the sacred ground of soul music. That night, Teddy announced he was canceling the show because of a sudden severe cold, only for the press to expose him hours later, drunkenly celebrating in a nightclub. A backstage worker recalled that Teddy left the bar close to 4 a.m., his voice hoarse from screaming all night like a madman. The next morning, he still brazenly called the organizers, his tone raspy and phony. "I can't even get out of bed." Yet Teddy Pendergrass's life didn't end with empty displays and lies years later. That same arrogance and reckless lifestyle led him to an unexpected turning point. On a March night in 1982, Teddy drove his armored Rolls-Royce down Lincoln Drive in Philadelphia. People said he had just left a late-night party, still reeking of alcohol and pungent cologne. The car sped through a dark curve, lost control, then slammed into a steel guardrail. The impact was so violent that the front end crumpled completely, and Teddy was trapped inside, motionless. When rescuers finally pulled him out, Teddy had been paralyzed from the chest down. After the accident, he was bound to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, though Teddy later tried to return to the stage, recording and performing a few shows. The spotlight never burned as brightly as before in his final years. He often appeared with a strained smile, concealing the bitterness everyone could see in his eyes. Curtis Mayfield never publicly commented on that tragedy, but those close to him said he once sighed and said, "Sometimes fate finds a way to teach people a lesson. The only problem is the price is too high." And from then on, whenever someone mentioned Teddy Pendergrass, Curtis only stayed silent, as if all the old resentment had dissolved into a quiet pity. 4. Barry White, the soul king and the regal vanity that made Curtis Mayfield loathe him. To the American public in the 1970s, Barry White was the voice as deep as thunder, a soul icon whose sensual songs filled millions of living rooms through the radio. But to Curtis Mayfield and many contemporaries, he was living proof of dirty power that would trample any rival to climb to the top. In 1974, as the single "Can't Get Enough of Your Love," Babe stormed the Billboard charts, The magazine also broke a scandal that rocked the entire music world. Barry and his management team had paid tens of thousands of dollars in cash to at least 3 major radio stations in Los Angeles and San Francisco to play his records on repeat, day and night. A member of a young soul group that had just won an American Music Award recalled that whenever their songs started to get requests on the air, the DJs would immediately receive fat envelopes with a note, "Don't disrupt the atmosphere Barry White is building." If rigging radio playlists already disgusted people, Barry's regal habits made them even sicker. No matter where he stayed, from the Beverly Wilshire Hotel to Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas, he demanded staff prepare full sets of imported French black silk sheets and infuse the room with rare sandalwood oil. A hotel manager recounted that Barry once flew into a rage and smashed a baccarat vase simply because they forgot to change the night lamp to the warm yellow glow he claimed helped keep his voice smooth as velvet. Curtis Mayfield was no stranger to that kind of diva tantrum, but what revolted him most was something few knew. Throughout 1975, Barry ordered all waiters and breakfast servers to bow their heads and never look directly into his face. If anyone broke that rule, they were immediately banned from the penthouse floor. A waiter at Caesar's Palace was once fined $500, a huge sum for minimum wage at the time, just because he accidentally glanced at Barry while setting down a tray of poached eggs. Barry believed that stray eyes could destroy his confidence and shatter the energy field around him before taping for Soul Train. But eventually, the spotlight Barry White flaunted could not last forever. In the 1980s, musical tastes shifted, his records began selling slowly, and major labels started cutting contracts one by one. People said there was a time when Barry had to pay out of his own pocket to rent local radio airtime just to keep his fading reputation alive. By the 1990s, Barry was consumed by illness. His weight soared, high blood pressure and severe kidney failure forced him onto dialysis several times a week. During many concerts, he no longer had the strength to stand on stage for long, resigning himself to sit in a black silk-covered leather chair, the last luxury that reminded him of the glory he once had. In July 2003, Barry White drew his final breath in a Los Angeles hospital at the age of 58. When the news spread, fans remembered him as the legendary voice behind immortal love songs. But to Curtis Mayfield and the many musicians Barry owed money, all that remained was a bitter memory of a man who spent his life buying fame, only to discover he could never buy respect. 5. Donny Hathaway, the two-faced angel who would break anything to reach glory. If you only heard Donny Hathaway's voice, you might believe he was the kindest soul singer in America. But Curtis Mayfield knew too well that behind that sweet tone was a fragile mind, ready to smash chairs, tear down curtains, and block colleagues' paths to demand royalties he had never earned. Many nights in Chicago, the Ambassador East Hotel management had to call emergency repairmen because Donny erupted in the middle of the night. A cleaning staff recalled that whenever Donny couldn't find the right key, he would grab a 30-kilogram velvet armchair and hurl it straight into the wall, leaving a huge round dent in the wood paneling. Sometimes he would pick up the desk phone and slam it repeatedly onto the floor until copper wires dangled like fish guts. There were times that simply because dinner wasn't to his taste, Donny would fly into a rage, rip the red velvet drapes into strips, muttering curses at the tour manager, calling him a coward who can't understand genius. One night in 1972, guests downstairs called the police, thinking there was a violent fight. When they burst in, they found Donny gasping for breath on a pile of broken chairs, his eyes blank as if he had just shed the mask of decency. Yet it was Donny's gentle facade that Curtis hated most of all. He could smile, shake your hand, pat your shoulder, and sweetly say, "You're the greatest inspiration of my life." Then that very evening, whisper vicious gossip to the producers. In 1972, Donny was rumored to have secretly met with Atlantic Records executives, spinning out damaging stories about a young R&B singer just to snatch the first release rights. Curtis was no stranger to dirty tactics, but he never expected to become a target himself. The most horrifying moment came in the summer of 1973 after a blazing show. Curtis had just stepped into the hotel hallway when Donny was already there waiting. He took Curtis's hand, squeezing it lightly like a dear brother, then suddenly murmured, "I think I deserve 1% of the royalties for People Get Ready. You know I contributed the arrangement ideas." Curtis jerked his hand away, his heart pounding with fury. That song was his lifeblood, and Donny had never even set foot in the recording studio. Donny Hathaway's life didn't end with midnight outbursts and backstabbing. As the stage lights receded, his mind began to fracture. Through the late 1970s, Donny lived in constant terror of being harmed, convinced someone had planted bugs in every studio, every hotel room, even inside his instruments. Those who worked with him recalled many nights Donny would sit motionless in a chair, hands trembling violently, murmuring prayers to God to save him from this invisible conspiracy. On January 13, 1979, Donny was found dead after plunging from the 15th floor of the Essex House Hotel in New York. Police concluded he had taken his own life during a severe breakdown. The news stunned the soul community. The press called him a doomed genius. But for Curtis, it only made the story more sorrowful. Curtis no longer felt anger toward Donny Hathaway. He only sighed and said, "Some people sing the gentlest songs about love, but end up never being able to love themselves." And from that day on, whenever someone mentioned Donny, Curtis would just stare into the distance, as if he could still see that hole in the wall of room 402 that had never truly healed. 6. Isaac Hayes, the soundtrack, King and the Chronic Debts that drove everyone mad. Now, let's return to March 1971 when Curtis Mayfield sat in the RCA studio in Chicago, listening as Isaac Hayes boasted about his dream to elevate soul to a cinematic level. At the time, Isaac was famous across America for his seductive baritone and his slick, bald-headed style, but the more famous he grew, the more he treated himself as the center of the universe. Once, in a film score meeting with Paramount, Isaac spoke with a disdainful tone, "I don't want anyone clinging on, especially those street soul guys. My music is the only thing classy enough for the big screen." Curtis sat across from him, his face flushing with anger at every word, yet only a week earlier. Isaac had been smirking and saying, "We'll split everything 50-50. I don't play dirty." But playing dirty was exactly Isaac Hayes' specialty. That summer, when Paramount announced the Shaft soundtrack project, Curtis was stunned. Isaac had flown alone to Los Angeles, handed in the demo, and signed an exclusive contract without bothering to say a word. Curtis felt like he had been stabbed deep in the back. If it had only been about broken promises, Curtis might have been able to swallow it. But Isaac's most infuriating habit was owing wages to his entire crew, a cunning form of hostage-taking, in the Stax studio in Memphis. After every grueling 12-hour session, when musicians were exhausted, Isaac would fold his arms and say, "Just sit tight, I need to look over the contract." A horn player recalled one night they waited from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. just because Isaac took a nap before he felt like signing the checks. He enjoyed making people squirm, never knowing whether they'd be paid. A sound engineer once said bluntly, "Working for Isaac Hayes is like gambling. You might record for a month and not see a penny." One October evening in 1972, Curtis stopped by Stax right as Isaac was stepping into the hall, holding a thick stack of envelopes. Everyone assumed he was about to hand out pay, but Isaac just gave a cold smile, stuffed the envelopes back into his coat pocket, and turned away. That night, more than 10 people sat huddled on chairs, their stomachs growling, waiting until dawn. Curtis watched that scene with disgust, wondering how a man who had just won an Oscar and wore expensive furs could be so petty. But that glory didn't last forever. In the years that followed, Isaac Hayes began drowning in mounting debt because of reckless spending and overextending his investments. By the late 1970s, Stax Records had collapsed, dragging him into financial ruin. People said there were nights when Isaac had to sell off pianos and song rights to pay creditors, while he quietly rented cheap hotel rooms, no longer demanding silk sheets or sandalwood oil like in his heyday. In his final years, Isaac Hayes tried to climb back, performing at casinos and small fairs. But his health gradually failed. In August 2008, he was found dead on the floor of his Memphis home, next to a treadmill still running, although the press praised his film music legacy. Many old colleagues still remembered those long nights when he owed everyone wages, the cold arrogance, and the way he could break his word without a flicker of guilt. To Curtis, it was proof that no matter how far a voice carried, it could never hide someone's true nature. And when the stage lights went dark for good, all that remained was the memory of a man who once had everything but never valued anyone. 7. Bobby Womack, the fake brother and all the stains he left behind. In the eyes of the American public, Bobby Womack was one of the greatest soul voices, someone who could blend blues, gospel, and funk into a hypnotic force. But to Curtis Mayfield, Bobby was just a phony brother willing to steal a friend's woman and walk away like nothing ever happened. Curtis never forgot the summer of 1971 when Bobby suddenly showed up beside the ex-girlfriend of a guitarist they had all played with in the same band. One day, they were calling each other brother. The next day, Bobby was parading around a Chicago club with his arm around her, boldly kissing her in front of the press cameras. When confronted, Bobby just gave a thin smile and said, "Everybody's got to find their own happiness." His most aggravating habit was always wearing those huge dark sunglasses all day long. Even in pitch-black dressing rooms or conference spaces, Curtis believed Bobby did it so he wouldn't have to greet anyone, pretending not to see his peers. One technician once said, "You look at those glasses, and you realize how little Bobby thought of any of us." But things only got worse when rumors spread that Bobby had hired paparazzi to tail Curtis, snapping photos of him holding a box of vitamins and twisting it into a headline. Curtis Mayfield sinks into addiction. A tabloid reporter admitted Bobby paid cash to make sure the story printed the same week Curtis released his new album. When Curtis heard it, his hand shook with fury. To him, it wasn't just a cheap shot, it was the most revolting betrayal. Bobby's scandals didn't stop there. In the early 70s, the entire soul world buzzed when he married Barbara Cook, Sam Cooke's widow, the man Bobby once called "my greatest brother." Many colleagues shook their heads in disgust, seeing it as a stain that could never be washed clean. But Bobby held his head high, bragging everywhere about his fated love, never sparing a thought for the dignity of the dead. In his last years, Bobby Womack was consumed by illness. He battled colon cancer, severe diabetes, and fading memory. People said there were nights he couldn't even recall the titles of the songs that once made him famous. In June 2014, Bobby drew his last breath at age 70. When the news of his passing spread, the press called him a soul legend steeped in controversy. But in Curtis's heart, a person's true worth had nothing to do with gold records or scandals under bright lights. It lived in the decency left behind when the spotlight went dark, and for the rest of his life. Curtis knew he would never forgive Bobby Womack, who had turned friendship into a commodity and burned to ash the trust of everyone who ever believed in him. 8. Bill Withers, saint of virtue or two-faced pretender. Bill Withers was always praised as the storyteller of working people, a humble voice that comforted millions of Americans, but to many soul musicians of his era, including Curtis Mayfield. Bill was nothing but a two-faced man preaching virtue while living a life of contradiction. Plenty of people loathed his obsessive smoking habit. Any studio Bill set foot in was thick with smoke. A sound engineer said after only 2 hours of work, the sheet music, mic cables, and even velvet curtains reeked so badly it was hard to breathe. Even when staff begged him to open a window, Bill coldly waved them off, saying, "Cold air ruins my voice." Curtis heard this and shook his head, What kind of virtue doesn't care about other people's lungs? What enraged colleagues even more was his messy personal life. In 1976, when Bill was at his peak fame, a Chicago hotel worker revealed he had seen Bill bringing two young women up to his room at the same time, the next morning. Bill appeared on stage, guitar in hand, preaching that family is the foundation of dignity. Rumors spread that Bill quietly maintained multiple affairs, but he always denied them, changing the subject with long speeches about loyalty. The breaking point came on September 18, 1977, when Bill was set to perform at Detroit's Fox Theater. He inspected the stage, scowled at the red velvet wall, then abruptly demanded the organizers repaint it a dark brown, when they said it couldn't be done in a few hours. Bill snapped, "Cancel the show. I'm not singing against that fake color." Over 200 to 500 fans stood packed together in the cold rain all night, without so much as an apology. In later years, Bill withdrew from the music industry, living quietly in a modest Los Angeles home. But those who had smelled the acrid smoke or heard the hollow sermons never forgot. He died in March 2020 from heart and lung complications, and the world mourned a gentle voice. But to Curtis, Bill Withers remained the painful proof that sometimes the sweetest voices conceal a person as bitter as gall. 9. Smokey Robinson, the smooth talker with a knife in his hand. Anyone who met Smokey Robinson backstage in the 70s knew one thing: he could praise you as a genius and quietly destroy your career the same night. To Curtis Mayfield. Smokey was no different from a snake in a velvet skin, smooth and soft, but always ready to strike deep. Curtis remembered clearly the night of September 12, 1974, after a big concert at Radio City Music Hall, when Smokey threw a victory party on the 10th floor of the Warwick Hotel, in a room soaked with wine and cigar smoke. Smokey lounged in an armchair, holding a glass of cognac, and began loudly telling stories of unforgettable nights of passion. He named two rising female singers and described every bedroom detail in a voice so high the whole room could hear. One woman fled outside, humiliated, while Curtis clenched his jaw and turned away. To him, nothing was more disgraceful than making someone's private life into cheap entertainment. But it didn't stop there. Smokey also liked to threaten anyone who defied him. In July 1975, when a young musician named Leon Bryant refused to sign a Motown contract, Smokey immediately sent a letter stamped in bright red, "We will sue you for sabotaging commercial opportunities." Leon was so terrified he fled Detroit for Atlanta and hid for a year. Another incident Curtis never forgot was the night of August 23, 1976. Smokey sent a bouquet of white orchids and an envelope congratulating you on your new album to Curtis's Chicago hotel. Curtis was still puzzled when the next day, the hotel manager brought him the bill for all the flowers as requested by the sender when Curtis angrily returned it. Smokey said nothing, just picked up the phone to call 3 more newspapers. But those two-faced games were only the tip of the iceberg. During Motown's golden era, Smokey Robinson was involved in scandals that disgusted many colleagues. In 1978, Rolling Stone published a story exposing Smokey's years-long affair with a Motown secretary, even as he was cultivating the image of a devoted husband. Rumor had it the relationship fueled so much tension that other artists quit in disgust. Curtis heard and only shook his head. To him, it was proof Smokey never truly loved anyone but himself. Another scandal erupted in 1983 when Motown prepared to reissue old albums by many artists. Smokey was accused of lobbying executives to put his own re-releases first, pushing his colleagues' records to the end of the schedule. A marketing manager at the time said Smokey once declared coldly, "With one nod from me, their records will stay locked in storage forever." Yet when he grew old, Smokey kept that polished exterior. He still appeared on stage with a gentle smile, reminiscing about Motown on TV specials. In spring 2020, he released a new album, at age 80, living proof of the incredible stamina of a soul voice. But to Curtis Mayfield, all that glamour couldn't erase the memory of the man who toasted you with one hand and whispered to ruin you with the other. And deep down, Curtis knew he would never trust that smile again. Curtis Mayfield passed away on a quiet winter morning, December 26, 1999, carrying a heart that had once throbbed for justice and love, but also held countless bitterness few dared admit. To the very end. He believed music was not just for lulling people with pretty stories, but for exposing the false masks of those once hailed as legends. The list of 9 names Curtis despised from the man in the stinking suit, to the one recording calls in secret. To the arrogant soul king wasn't only an accusation, but a mirror reflecting the raw cost of lust and hypocrisy traded for a shot at fame. So, among all these names, which one surprised you most? Leave a comment below. And don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the backstage secrets buried for decades.